but I guess I played about 6 instruments, and I started playing the harmonica, which I've never played on a record yet, and I still yet want to play one on a record.
Why not?
Well, I don't know. I just hadn't.
An unreleased interview with James Brown has finally surfaced, and what he revealed about Elvis Presley changes everything. For decades, fans have argued about whether Elvis truly respected the roots of his music or simply borrowed from black culture without acknowledgement. But in this candid conversation, captured off camera and hidden for years, James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, doesn't hold back. His words are raw, emotional, and at times, shocking. Did he see Elvis as a thief, a friend, or something much deeper? This unseen interview peels away the myth and exposes a truth that few dared to speak while both men were alive. James Brown first crossed paths with Elvis Presley during the explosive 1950s rock and roll boom, a time when the entire American music landscape was shifting almost overnight. In the unseen interview, Brown recalls that first meeting vividly, saying Elvis was nothing like the brash, hip-shaking rebel the public knew. Instead, he came across as quiet, almost shy, with a soft-spoken nature that contrasted sharply with his wild stage persona. Brown describes how Elvis carried himself with an aura that demanded attention without him even trying. He remembers Elvis listening more than speaking, watching with laser focus as Brown moved, sang, and commanded a stage. Brown says he could tell immediately that Elvis was a student of the craft, someone who studied every performer before him and absorbed it like a sponge. What struck Brown most was Elvis's genuine curiosity. He didn't come across as arrogant, but as someone eager to learn, eager to understand the heartbeat of the music that was transforming the nation. Brown admits there was a mix of admiration and tension in that moment. On one hand, he felt Elvis respected the black artists who came before him, but on the other hand, he knew many of his peers saw Elvis as someone taking opportunities that weren't offered to them. He explains how, during their conversation, Elvis openly admitted he had been inspired by gospel choirs, blues singers, and soul musicians he grew up hearing, and Brown believed him. Yet he also knew that while Elvis was being propelled into superstardom, many of the artists who inspired him were still locked out of mainstream radio and television. Brown remembers feeling torn, impressed by Elvis's humility, but deeply aware of the unfair imbalance the industry created. He even mentions how backstage, other black musicians whispered among themselves, questioning whether Elvis's rise was really about talent, or simply the color of his skin opening doors they could never walk through. Brown insists, however, that Elvis never dismissed those voices. He would nod, acknowledge the debt he owed, and carry on with a weight that seemed to grow heavier as his fame exploded. Brown's reflections in the interview paint a complicated picture. Two young men standing at the crossroads of history, both aware they were reshaping American music, but also aware that only one of them was being crowned the king. In the unseen interview, James Brown reveals moments with Elvis Presley that the public never witnessed. Times away from the flashing cameras, screaming fans, and headlines that painted both men as larger-than-life icons. Brown recalls being invited to Graceland and describes it not as the glamorous palace people imagined, but as a place where Elvis seemed to seek refuge from the outside world. He remembers evenings when the music wasn't blasting, when there were no rehearsals, just quiet conversations stretching late into the night. Brown shares that Elvis would open up about the crushing weight of being called the King, a title he confessed he never fully embraced. According to Brown, Elvis admitted that while the world saw him as untouchable, inside he felt trapped, almost like a prisoner in his own kingdom. Brown describes Elvis speaking with a vulnerability few would believe, admitting that he envied soul performers like Brown, who could be raw, passionate, and unapologetically expressive, while he was constantly forced to uphold the image of the clean-cut American boy. Brown even recounts Elvis saying that every move he made was scrutinized, every friendship judged, every word calculated by managers and handlers who didn't always care about his happiness, only his image. Brown reflects on these confessions with a mix of sympathy and sadness, explaining that in those private talks, he stopped seeing Elvis as a rival or cultural figure and started seeing him as a man. He remembers one particular night when Elvis poured his heart out about how isolated he felt, saying that despite being surrounded by people, he had never felt lonelier. Brown admits he understood that feeling all too well, recognizing the same emptiness in himself when the roar of the crowd faded and silence crept in. The Godfather of Soul says Elvis was caught between worlds, idolized by white America, but longing for the acceptance and respect of the black musicians whose music shaped him. Brown emphasizes that Elvis never denied that truth. In fact, he seemed haunted by it, as if he knew his success came with a debt he could never fully repay. Brown insists these were not rehearsed words or public statements meant to polish an image, but the quiet honesty of a man wrestling with the cost of fame. Behind closed doors, Elvis wasn't the myth or the king. He was just a man trying to carry the unbearable weight of being everything to everyone, and, in the process, slowly losing himself. James Brown doesn't dodge the question that has followed Elvis Presley for decades. Did Elvis steal black music? In the unseen interview, Brown leans forward, his voice measured but firm, and says, "The truth is far more complicated than the simple accusation people like to throw around." He admits without hesitation that Elvis rose to fame by performing songs rooted in blues, gospel, and rhythm and blues traditions that black artists had been singing for years before Elvis ever stepped on a stage. But Brown clarifies that Elvis never once claimed he invented the music. According to Brown, Elvis was always quick to point out his influences, often naming Little Richard, B.B. King, Fats Domino, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe as the foundation of his style. Brown says he witnessed Elvis privately acknowledging those names with a kind of reverence, as though he knew he was standing on ground that others had already built. Yet, Brown also doesn't shy away from the resentment that lingered in the community. He explains how black musicians, himself included, could pour their souls into a song only to watch it ignored by mainstream white audiences, until someone like Elvis sang it. Then suddenly, it became a hit, played on every radio station, promoted on television, and earning more in a single release than the original artist might see in a lifetime. Brown calls it a painful reality of a segregated industry that valued the product but not the creators. He recalls heated conversations among musicians who felt Elvis was benefiting from doors that remained firmly shut to them. "Elvis got paid what we should have been paid," Brown admits in the interview, summing up decades of frustration. But even as he acknowledges this injustice, Brown insists Elvis wasn't the enemy. He was caught in a system built to exploit. He says Elvis was aware of the imbalance and carried guilt about it, often trying to give credit in interviews, though it never changed the fact that the checks, the tours, and the headlines carried his name, not theirs. Brown reflects on how history made Elvis the face of rock and roll, while the architects of the sound remained in the shadows. Yet he stresses that Elvis never dismissed those shadows. He lived with the knowledge of them every day. In the end, Brown's words reveal a truth that isn't simple or easy to digest. Elvis Presley didn't steal, but the world gave him what it refused to give others. And that unfairness still echoes through music history. James Brown lights up in the unseen interview when he begins talking about the unspoken rivalry he and Elvis Presley shared on stage. He laughs as he recalls how Elvis would sometimes sneak into the wings of a show just to study him, not as a critic, but as a student of performance. Brown remembers vividly how Elvis paid close attention to the way he used the microphone, the way he strutted across the stage, and even the way he dropped into splits to make the crowd scream. Brown admits that it amused him at first, but he quickly realized Elvis wasn't imitating for fun. He was learning, internalizing every move, and adapting it into his own style. But the admiration wasn't one-sided. Brown confesses that he too was captivated when he watched Elvis perform. He describes seeing Elvis step onto the stage and immediately command the room without a word, his presence alone electrifying the crowd in a way Brown admitted was both inspiring and intimidating. He had something you couldn't teach, Brown says firmly, "You either had it or you didn't." And Elvis had it. He elaborates on how both men approached performance as something bigger than music. It was theater. It was spectacle. It was about giving the audience a piece of yourself they couldn't forget. Brown recalls one night when they spoke backstage after separate shows, joking about who could make an audience scream louder. Elvis teased Brown, saying nobody could top the Godfather of Soul, while Brown shot back that Elvis's hip shake had women fainting before he even sang a note. Beneath the humor, however, was deep respect, a recognition that each man pushed the other to elevate his craft. Brown admits there were moments of jealousy, moments when he wished the industry had rewarded him with the same global recognition Elvis received. But he also acknowledges that the competition fueled him. He says it was Elvis's relentless showmanship that pushed him to constantly reinvent his own stage performances, to never settle, to always chase something greater. Brown describes it as a friendly rivalry, a kind of artistic duel where the prize wasn't money or fame, but the ability to leave the crowd breathless. For Brown, Elvis wasn't just a fellow performer. He was a benchmark, someone who set a bar so high that even he, the Godfather of Soul, had to stretch to reach it. In the end, Brown admits that while fans may have debated who was the better performer, he knew the truth. They were two sides of the same coin, both driven by an unstoppable hunger to give audiences something they had never seen before. In the unseen interview, James Brown speaks with a heavy tone when he describes the dark side of fame, a burden both he and Elvis Presley carried in silence. Brown explains that the public only saw the lights, the screaming crowds, the gold records, and the newspaper headlines, but they never saw the exhaustion, the loneliness, and the way fame slowly consumed a man from the inside. He recalls conversations with Elvis, where the king admitted he felt like a commodity more than a human being, a product his handlers packaged and sold, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. Brown says Elvis confided that he often felt he couldn't escape the role the world had assigned him, that the name Elvis Presley had become bigger than the man himself, and that no matter how hard he tried, he could never step out of that shadow. Brown sympathizes deeply, because he knew that same weight, endless touring, sleepless nights, and the crushing responsibility of being expected to deliver perfection every time you stepped on stage. He recalls one haunting moment when Elvis admitted he feared dying young, consumed by the very empire he had built. Brown admits those words stayed with him, because he too had stared into the abyss of fame and wondered if it would swallow him whole. He explains that, for both men, adoration came with isolation, because the more people loved the image, the harder it became to find someone who truly cared for the man behind it. Brown paints a vivid picture of Elvis sitting quietly in a room full of people, everyone laughing, drinking, and celebrating, yet his eyes distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. Brown insists this wasn't self-pity, but the reality of a man who gave everything to the world and found little left for himself. He draws parallels to his own life, admitting that he too would return to hotel rooms after sold-out shows only to sit in silence, feeling the weight of emptiness pressing down. The Godfather of Soul says the public never wanted to hear about the struggles. They wanted the myth, the legend, the indestructible star. And so both he and Elvis smiled, performed, and carried the burden alone. Brown concludes that fame, for all its riches and glory, was also a curse, a golden cage that glittered on the outside but locked its prisoners within. In the unseen interview, James Brown addresses one of the most explosive topics of Elvis Presley's legacy: race. Brown doesn't sugarcoat the reality of the 1950s and 60s, a time when segregation still gripped America and black musicians were systematically denied the opportunities their white counterparts enjoyed. He admits openly that many in the black community felt bitterness watching Elvis break barriers they themselves were never allowed to approach. And Brown confesses that he too felt that sting. He describes the frustration of seeing songs born in black churches and blues clubs suddenly rocket to mainstream success, once sung by a young white man from Mississippi. Yet Brown carefully distinguishes between Elvis the man and the system that elevated him. He insists Elvis was not the enemy, segregation was. Brown recalls how Elvis would praise black musicians in private, how he spoke with admiration for B.B. King, Little Richard, and Jackie Wilson, and how he recognized them as the architects of the very sound he was celebrated for. Brown explains that Elvis often wished he could be more outspoken, but his handlers carefully controlled his image, warning him against saying or doing anything that might threaten his position as America's golden boy. Brown says this always frustrated him because he believed Elvis wanted to do more, but lacked the freedom to act. He recalls one moment when Elvis told him directly that he felt guilty about receiving credit for music that wasn't entirely his, saying, "I just sang what I loved, but the world gave me more than I asked for." Brown admits that quote stayed with him for years because it revealed a side of Elvis most people never knew, a man deeply aware of the racial divide and the unfairness that fueled his rise. Brown also remembers the backlash from within his own community. He describes heated debates backstage, with some artists condemning Elvis as a thief, while others argued that he was simply a vessel, a bridge that carried black music into white households at a time when America wasn't ready to hear it from its original creators. Brown stresses that Elvis always showed him respect personally, never looking down on him, never dismissing him, but treating him as an equal. Still, he laments that Elvis never used his enormous platform to directly challenge segregation, believing that had he done so, it might have changed history. Brown concludes that Elvis's relationship with race was filled with contradictions. He was both a beneficiary of systemic racism and a genuine admirer of black culture, both a symbol of injustice and a man who loved the very music born out of struggle. For Brown, this complexity was the truth the world never wanted to acknowledge, but one he felt compelled to finally share. As the unseen interview moves into the later years of Elvis Presley's life, James Brown's tone softens and becomes heavy with emotion. He describes watching the king of rock and roll slowly unravel under the weight of fame, addiction, and isolation, a decline that mirrored the warnings Elvis himself had once shared in their private conversations. Brown recalls the last time he saw Elvis perform, and he says it was one of the most heartbreaking sights of his life. He remembers the crowd still screaming as if they were in the 1950s, the energy in the room still electric, but the man on stage was different. Elvis's voice still had its power, but his body looked broken, his movements slow and labored, his once legendary charisma dulled by exhaustion and medication. Brown admits he left that performance in tears, unable to shake the image of a man who had given everything to the world and now had nothing left for himself. He says Elvis's health had deteriorated so much that even those closest to him knew the end was near, yet no one seemed able to stop it. Brown reflects on how fame traps you in an endless cycle of giving more, pushing harder, and performing even when your soul is begging for rest. He compares it to being on a runaway train, one that starts with applause and fortune, but eventually barrels toward destruction if you can't find the brakes. Elvis, Brown explains, never found those brakes. He talks about reaching out, about moments when he wanted to step in and pull Elvis aside, but life and careers pulled them in different directions, and soon the gap between them grew too wide. Brown reveals that he often thought about calling or visiting in those final years, but didn't, and that regret haunted him after Elvis's death. He recalls how the news of Elvis's passing hit him harder than he expected, not just because he lost a fellow performer, but because he lost a man he understood on a deeper level than most. He describes sitting alone after hearing the news, remembering the young, shy man he first met, and contrasting it with the broken figure he had last seen on stage. Brown admits that Elvis's death was more than a tragedy. It was a warning. He saw in it the dangers of fame unchecked, of a life consumed by expectations, and of a man who carried too much for too long. Brown confesses he sometimes wondered if he himself would end the same way, destroyed by the same forces. He speaks of Elvis's decline as not just a personal loss, but as a reflection of how the music industry chews up its stars and discards them once they can no longer perform. He emphasizes that Elvis's final years should not be remembered as a fall from grace, but as the tragic cost of being larger than life, of embodying an image so powerful that even the man himself could no longer live up to it. Brown closes this part of the interview by saying, Elvis's story is not just about music or fame, it is about humanity, about the fragility behind the myth, and about the devastating price of being crowned king. As the unseen interview draws to a close, James Brown delivers what he calls his ultimate truth about Elvis Presley, a reflection that strips away decades of myth, controversy, and speculation. Brown leans forward and makes it clear, Elvis was not a thief, not a fraud, not the villain some painted him to be. He was, in Brown's words, a vessel, a bridge who carried the sound of Black America into white living rooms during a time when segregation ruled the land. Brown acknowledges with honesty that the system was unfair, that Elvis was celebrated and rewarded in ways that Black artists were denied, and that this reality caused anger and resentment that will always linger. Yet Brown insists that Elvis never denied where the music came from, never pretended he invented it, and always carried a quiet humility when speaking about those who inspired him. Brown recalls Elvis once telling him, "I didn't make this music, I just loved it enough to sing it." For Brown, that simple statement captured everything: the love, the respect, the innocence, and the guilt that defined Elvis's relationship with the art form. Brown admits that the pain of inequality still haunts him, but he refuses to let that pain erase the truth that Elvis loved Black music with his whole being. He explains that Presley's influence helped open doors, even if those doors were still unfairly guarded, and that his presence forced conversations in homes that might never have listened otherwise. Brown insists this doesn't excuse the imbalance, but it does make Elvis's role more complicated than a simple story of theft. He remembers Elvis as a man trapped by the crown placed on his head, someone who never asked to be called the king, but who wore the title until it broke him. Brown's words grow emotional as he describes Elvis not as a legend, but as a man, one who loved deeply, suffered silently, and carried the contradictions of his time on his shoulders. He says Elvis lived and died with a heart full of music and a soul weighed down by burdens that most will never understand. Brown adds that those who accuse Elvis of cultural theft miss the deeper tragedy, that he was as much a victim of the system as he was a beneficiary of it, elevated to godhood, while slowly stripped of his humanity. Brown concludes with a final statement that feels like both a eulogy and a confession. Elvis loved the music, and the music loved him back. That's the truth I'll take to my grave. With those words, the Godfather of Soul closes the chapter on a conversation hidden for decades, offering the world a glimpse into a friendship, a rivalry, and a bond that transcended race, fame, and time. For Brown, Elvis Presley was not the enemy, nor the untouchable king, but a man caught in history's storm, both triumph and tragedy, both sinner and saint. And now, thanks to this unseen interview, the veil has been lifted, and the truth about Elvis Presley, as seen through the eyes of James Brown, has finally been revealed.